So last time when we were together, when you were watching the last episode in this, it was key geologic principles we were talking about, and really I tied it into a lot of the historic figures in geology. And so we talked about, well, first about the development of heliocentrism as opposed to geocentrism, the old idea that the Earth was the center of the universe. And so we talked about the earliest scientists, and then we talked about Steno and how Steno made those huge contributions: superposition, original horizontality, principle of lateral continuity. And as we continued on, we talked about other folks like James Hutton. James Hutton, very influential. We regard him as the father of modern geology. Now we're going to move on. And so the next step along the way is a young man who trained as a geologist, and his name is Charles Darwin. And so Charles Darwin was actually not a biologist. He was a geologist first. And he hired on to be a part of a cruise that went around the entire world, took 3 years. He was on the HMS Beagle, Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle. And he hired on as the natural scientist for this. And it was a wise choice, actually, by the folks who commissioned this. And so when they left Britain, they sailed along the east coast of South America. But first they stopped along the Canary Islands. And so in the Canary Islands, they took on provisions, and he made some key observations there about the volcanoes that are on in the Canary Islands, in Tenerife, and some of the other islands in that area. And then when they sailed along the coast of South America, when they stopped near Buenos Aires, he found some whale fossils, and so they were able to collect some of these things. So they went in for provisions near Buenos Aires as well. And so they sailed through the Straits of Magellan, and then they sailed up the west coast of South America, and then they took a left and started across the Pacific. And when they did that, they went through the Galapagos Islands, and that's where Darwin really, really shined with his observations. And so he was making observations. In this case, he was looking at anything he could look at, really. So there are iguanas there. The swimming iguanas are unusual from any place. It's the only place on Earth where they occur, the swimming iguanas. There are also some giant tortoises there. But the thing that really caught and captured his attention were the finches. And so he went ashore and shot birds, essentially, to document what they were to begin with. And he found that they were all finches for the most part. And so he's, 2,000, 3,000 miles out in the middle of the Pacific. So how did they get there, right? So how did the tortoises get there? And so those are all questions, it's like, and you have to have more than one tortoise to make a whole population of tortoises. And the tortoises don't change from island to island, okay? There are different species, okay? So the different species, but they're still tortoises, giant tortoises in each one of those. So, it's really kind of a neat story. And so on each island, there are different tortoises. And different species of tortoise, right? So some of them had slightly different shapes and different, necks and things like that. But it was really the finches that caught his attention, and so he went ashore and began hunting birds, essentially. And so they even have some penguins there in the Galapagos. And so when he did that, he began to notice that their beaks were different, not the penguins, but the finches. And so their beaks were very different. Some of them were really designed to catch insects. Some of them were seed crackers. Some of them were nut crackers, essentially. So they developed this whole pattern or different array of beak structures on their, their head, right? And so they were able to take and fill different niches in the island, so biological niches where they were able to do and eat different things. He eventually incorporated these ideas into his ideas for evolution. And what you see actually in this diagram over on the left-hand side here, you can see how he recognized each one of the different finches is very similar to the other ones. And so he made what he thought was a sort of evolutionary tree. And he came up with a mechanism. He finally, he decided, after cogitating on this for a while, that these things were actually a result of natural selection. In other words, there was a selection pressure to find a mate who had the same characteristics that could eat the same foods, for instance, and then developed, so you have successive breeding generation after generation after generation. Well, how did the finches get here to begin with? They probably were blown in by a storm, a pair of them at least. But then from there, they went out. Of course, they can fly island to island. And so then they began to vary from island to island as well. And so he blamed it on natural selection. And so this natural selection says that, if you're eating on insects, you would find somebody that would actually be able to, another bird that would be able to do the same sort of thing. That's a selection pressure, they call that. But you have the same common characteristics. And so what is evolution? It's a change in the gene frequency over generations. It's a change in the gene frequency. And so you may have at times drought, or you may have rainy seasons, so it may favor one over the other. And today we know that that's just one of the possible ways in which you can have organisms evolve. Species will evolve that way. The other one is mutation. They didn't know anything about genetics at the time, but mutation, as it turns out, is pretty important. And then later, when people began to study this sort of material in the 1940s and 1950s, they knew that there were different kind of patterns of migration. Okay, so you could get clusters of certain animals that would be in certain areas, and there may be barriers then, right? So for instance, the channels between the islands would serve as a barrier for the evolution, right? So you'd have one species perhaps on one island more commonly than you'd have on the other island. And then also there's genetic drift. Even within that population, there are going to be certain characteristics that will change. Well, he recognized that, and he came up with this idea just in time to beat another person who was already working on the same idea named Wallace. And so he called this idea natural selection. And it was it was The Origin of Species that was the name of the book that he wrote from this. And that was in the 1850s, early 1850s, late 1840s. And so with this idea, people adopted it immediately. It's like, wow, this is brilliant. This is great stuff. And then they realized it's like, this may stand in contrast to what is in the Bible. And so then people got really scared about what they were thinking. And so many of the more fundamentalist styles of faiths, they didn't appreciate the idea that, perhaps that, animals could actually cause their own evolution that way. But when it comes right down to it, there are a lot of arguments that people make for evolution. It's been tested time and again, and so therefore it's regarded as theory and not just a hypothesis. And there are people who have other philosophical leanings, who have other ideas. And so, for instance, complexity theory is one of them, I think it's called. That things are just too complex to be able to have evolved that way. Well, I got to tell you, for instance, they often cite the example of the eye, but we know that in the earliest known fossils that they had eyes. And so that would be an example of a trilobite, for instance, and that's what's on this image here over on the left. And that's a Redlicchia, I think it is. Oh, Paradoxides, yeah. So it's one of the earliest varieties of trilobites, and they had eyes that were much like a fly's eyes, in fact. And so they made their lenses out of calcite, as it turns out. So calcite, little receptors that would funnel the light in, and they would be able to make and their vision from this. It's almost 360 degree, like one of these new 360 degree cameras, right? It wrapped all the way around. Well, they were being predated upon. That's why they had skeletons. Okay, so they had. There's another animal named Lagania. It used to be known as. Oh gosh, what was the name of it? It was. No, it wasn't Wilwaxia. It was there was another one. Anyway, it was a predator of this organism. It was large, it was like 10, 20 centimeters long, and they would prey on trilobites. And so in this case, the trilobites needed that vision in order to escape from their predators. And they did that with their vision, right? And so two eyes are on the side of what looks to be the head of this organism. In fact, that little bulbous part up there protects the stomach, as it turns out. They have a feeding structure that's at the bottom that feeds directly into it. Trilobites, as it turns out, are a lot like insects because they're arthropods, right? And so, in fact, their brain is in the center of their back in the spinal column, essentially. And so they're a lot like roaches in that way. But these are sea roaches, okay, some of the earliest life forms on Earth. And it took the geologists to recognize that. And so actually it was Darwin's teacher who studied these sort of things in the country of Wales, of all places. His name was Adam Sedgwick. And he and Darwin actually had gone on a trip before he left on the cruise of the Beagle. And so they went to northern Wales, and they studied some of they collected trilobites there, among other things. And actually Sedgwick regarded those as the earliest fossil-bearing strata that were known, and he called them the Cambrian, after the Cambrian Mountains in Cymru, which is the ancient Welsh name for Wales, the country of Wales. And so we know the trilobites are some of the underpinning for how Darwin got his understanding about these things as well, because there's a lot of different kinds of trilobites, but they would not all occur in the same bed. You had to go up through the succession in order to see all the various different kinds of trilobites. And so there's a faunal succession that goes along with this. And so in the sedimentary rocks, there are some old rocks at the bottom. This is superposition, right? Old rocks at the bottom and younger rocks. And so in these progressively younger rocks, there would be other varieties of trilobites, and then you would find other varieties of trilobites. And so the trilobites, in fact, give us this picture for evolution in and of themselves, all the way from Cambrian time until the mass extinction, the largest mass extinction on Earth, which was at the end of the Permian. And so the trilobites lived at a time period called the Paleozoic, ancient life, in other words. And so this ancient life had flowered into this sort of tree-like version of evolution as well. And so on this diagram, not only do you see what a trilobite looks like, but you see the various families over here on the right-hand side in that chart. Now, that chart is arranged so it shows the distance between the different kinds of families of these trilobites. But then over on the right-hand side, the very far right-hand side, you can see the time periods. And so the time periods, well, the Cambrian starts about 542 million years ago. And the end of the Permian was 252 million years ago. So it's a history of evolution for about, well, almost 200 million years. And so that is the Paleozoic right there. And so it is a principle that seems to work, because you don't find any dinosaurs in any of those rocks. In the very end of it, like at the Carboniferous and into the Permian, you get some early forms of reptiles, but you don't get dinosaurs. Dinosaurs don't evolve, in fact, until you get into the Mesozoic Mesozoic era, which is the next section higher than the Permian then. And so instead, what you get are, during Devonian time, you get the first amphibians, and then during the Carboniferous, you get the first reptiles. And then the reptiles kind of flourished all the way into the Permian, but then they went extinct, a lot of them. But some of them made it through, of course. And so even our relatives made it through. And we're related to the reptiles back then. So that's the story of evolution. I want to show you what some of these animals are like now, because a lot of people is like, well, how do we go about knowing all of that material? How do I know that they're... Well, it's because people have gone out and studied them. They've done that for about 200 years now, almost 200 years. And so in some places it has been 200 years. And so they find fossils like foraminifera up here in the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, upper left. On the upper right-hand side, those are bivalves. Well, those are down at the ocean today. In fact, we have forams that live in the oceans today as well. We have brachiopods that are still alive, and we have bryozoans. Bryozoans used to be only in marine rocks, but now they've made their way into fresh water, whether it's on the feet of birds or some way, but they were able to exist in ponds today. So even in Missouri, we have bryozoans. But in the ancient record, the only time that you get are these marine fossils like this. And so bryozoans are a major part of that. So bryozoans are actually related to brachiopods over here. That sort of bivalve shell that you see in the lower left-hand side here. And they're not related, in fact, to the mollusks, which are up at the top, which are more closely related. And both of them are probably related to worms of some sort. Foraminifera, on the other hand, are so primitive that those skeletons, those shells, are made out of they're made out of calcite in this image anyway. But they're only one cell. they're the largest only single-celled organism on this planet, and so that's forams. Forams, absolutely astonishing how they developed and have evolved themselves, right? And so there are different forams that you find through the stratigraphic record as well. Gastropods have done the same thing. Gastropods are a type of a mollusk as well. And so if bivalves are mollusks, so are gastropods. That means stomach foot. Bivalves used to be called pelecypods. It was kind of like a stomach foot, I guess it was. And then gastropods, well, stomach foot is the gastropods. Pelecypods are I forget what that means, but the cephalopods, in fact, are a head-shaped thing, right? So head was what that came from. And so cephalopods would include things like the living nautilus. And so in the deep oceans today, you get these shells of a sea creature that's a lot like a squid, or it's a lot like like an octopus, but it has a shell around it and it shoots ink and then it jets itself. Really brilliant, smart creatures. They have eyes too. Not related to the trilobites, as it turns out, but a very different kind of eye. So eyes have been around for a long time. At the lower left-hand side, you see an ostracode, and in fact, that's what's on the lower right-hand side as well. It's a special type of fossilization called phosphatization, and that fossilization has preserved even the soft parts in these things. So when people get into rocks and start studying the faunas and everything, they find these amazing sort of discoveries. And one of those happened back in the 1980s when in Sweden they found these ostracodes that are related, well, they're related to trilobites. In fact, they're a bivalve sort of arthropod. And so really amazing sort of creatures. They live in freshwater today as well. But back during the Ordovician, when they first arrived, and evolved these shells. That was back in the early Ordovician, and they were all marine back then. So there's this succession. So we have Cambrian, we have the Ordovician, we have the Silurian, the Devonian. Devonian is the age of the rocks that, Silurian and Devonian were the age of the rocks that we saw at Sicker Point. And so in the lower Gala limestone in Scotland there, you would find fossils like this, right? But deep water fossils, essentially. So what it did for us is it gave us a geologic timescale. All of these early geologists were also paleontologists, or they knew enough to collect the fossils out of these things as well. And many of those went into the museums. And so in the museums, they host all of these various fossils from around the world. And here's our time scale, in fact, right here. So you may not know about him, but there's a guy named Ray Troll. He was a cartoonist, sort of, and back in the 1980s, I guess it was, he was really famous for doing T-shirts that were kind of, well, sciencey, I guess you could say. He teamed up with a paleontologist, and they went out in the field, and he wrote a book called Traveling the Fossil Highway. As it turns out, 90% of geologic time, there's not much of a record of fossils in it. And that's because it was before there were really common fossils back then. The metazoans hadn't evolved yet. The metazoans, in fact, wouldn't evolve until you get into Cambrian time. So 542 million years ago. So now we have the Archean down here at the bottom, which is really ancient rocks. When there were hardly any living life forms at all. There were some that were single-celled organisms like pond scum almost. They made things like stromatolites, however, and stromatolites had photosynthesis, and they were able to generate an early oxygen-rich atmosphere. Well, it didn't become oxygen-rich until the Proterozoic, the second time. And in fact, even then, it was only like 30%, right? So even the base of the Cambrian, there was very low oxygen content in the atmosphere. And we know that from studying the calcite that is in ancient rocks like this. You can actually calculate what the ratio is between oxygen 17, 16, 18, and you can build models based on that about the oxygen content. So it may have been about 50% at the beginning of Cambrian time, but by the end of Cambrian time, it is pretty well, where it is close to closer to where it was today. And so we go into the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian. Those two together make up the Carboniferous, and then after that you get the Permian. And then it's the Mesozoic, and that's the age of dinosaurs, right? And so that's the Mesozoic, and that's the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. As it turns out, mammals first evolved in the Triassic, as did the first dinosaurs. Okay, so if you're really interested in this sort of thing, you can take my historical geology. I'll make a plug for it right now. Historical geology in the fall semester, in fall 21 here, you'll be able to take that course if you're really interested in this sort of stuff. If you want to become a geologist, that's a good place to go next along your education here. So we have the Triassic. The dinosaurs evolved in the Triassic. There was another major extinction at the end of the Triassic. And then the Jurassic, of course, you know about Jurassic Park, right? And Cretaceous, in fact, was a very lush time on Earth. They estimate that the oxygen content in the atmosphere for that time period was roughly 30%. So if you're a large organism like a dinosaur, it helps to have an oxygen charged system like this. Well, we don't have that much oxygen in our atmosphere today. I think we got closer to like 18, 20%, something like that. But here we have the Cretaceous. So everything was going great for dinosaurs. They didn't have a space program yet, but they were maybe thinking about it. I don't know. Well, they're probably thinking about eating their next meal, I guess, too, because it takes a lot of energy to power those big muscles like that. Instead, what happened was there was a meteorite that crashed down in Mexico, of all places, right? So in the Yucatan Peninsula, kabam, and that was the extinction of the dinosaurs. It was not, however, the extinction of most of the dinosaurs. Let me put it that way. The birds survived, and the birds are related to dinosaurs. Today, we say that the extinction actually caused, that extinction at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. It says Paleocene on here. Actually, the Paleocene, the Eocene, the Oligocene, and the Miocene are lumped together, and it's called the Paleogene. And then the last ones on this list, the Pliocene, the Pleistocene, the Holocene, those are lumped together, and we call that the Neogene today. And so, but anyway, that is the KPG boundary, they call it. It's the Cretaceous. The symbol K is for Cretaceous, because we have too many other C's out there, like the Cambrian and the Carboniferous and so forth. So they used a K to abbreviate Cretaceous here. And so with the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, KPG, that's where this large meteorite struck. And that was about 12 kilometers across and left a crater that was probably about 150 kilometers across. But it wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs. So everything but the birds, in other words. So the avian dinosaurs continued on, as did the mammals, as it turns out. So when the things that survived that extinction event, you had to be kind of lucky, I guess you could say. Some of them did, and our ancestors did, for instance. So the early mammals made it across, and here we are today. So that geologic timescale that we have, if we have stromatolites that go back almost 3 billion years, life showed up here pretty early on this planet. But there are eras even earlier than when life was here. But when that life shows up in the Archean, and then in the Proterozoic, and then some of the earliest body fossils are found in the late Neoproterozoic, and then we begin to get into the Paleozoic, and commonly you get fossils everywhere. And so through the Paleozoic, through the Mesozoic, through the Cenozoic, of course, and that's what we're in today. And so that's our geologic timescale in a way over here in cartoon form, because it's just, easier to understand, I guess. But you can see the age dates over there. The thing is, there's no clock on there's not a wristwatch on any of these sort of organisms to tell you when they lived and when they died. That whole timescale here, all those names, That was the only thing we knew about back in the 1800s when people were looking at these fossils. They only knew that there was certain fossils after other fossils. It took until the 1950s to put that other scale over here, which shows the absolute age dates. And so when we talk about the time periods and the names of these time periods like Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic, Paleozoic, ancient life, Mesozoic, middle life, Cenozoic, modern life, and then all of the time periods that go along with it, right? So Cambrian, Ordovician, all those periods in there, those things we didn't put numbers on until the 1950s, and they keep getting better and better all the time, in fact. So in those same processes that we understand. So in other words, okay, before I move on with this, that idea that you can take layer after layer after layer that have fossils in it that show this flourishing of life and a history of life on this planet, that's called the relative time scale. And it's all based on one layer overlaying another layer. That's superposition, isn't it? And so faunal succession and superposition go together like this. And the absolute time scale over there is in the 1950s, and there's one guy who made that possible for us. He's a real hero, actually, when it comes right down to it, because today children don't have to breathe atmospheric lead because of him, in fact. And so we're going to get into that story in the next episode. But he's the one who came up and says, wow, these meteorites that I studied, they're 4.56 billion years old. And he gave us the first really accurate age date on this geologic time scale, because meteorites, as it turns out, are one of the ways that we understand Earth too. So we're going to move on from here. I've got a few more key geologic concepts to get across to you, and you kind of understand most of these already by now. One of the things is we talk about cross-cutting relationships, and actually it was Hutton who came up with that idea. He says if you have an intrusive and it cuts the other rocks, or if you have a fault or an unconformity, the older rocks are below and the younger rocks are above that unconformity, or that fault, whatever it is, had to cut something that was already existent there. And so it cuts strata, right? So anytime you cut straight, and we talked a little bit about that when we talked about plutons as well. So with some of the intrusions that are discordant, right, like dikes, not so much sills, right, because sills come in laterally and kind of expand, but dikes will cut across the beds. It's discordant, and that's a cross-cutting relationship. And that was actually Hutton who came up with that idea. Remember Glen Tilt, right, the intrusion of those granites into that metamorphic rock. Lyell is the guy over here at the right now. And so Lyell, another Scot as it turns out, he also recognized that sometimes when you weather and erode rocks, that you will take those older rocks and incorporate them into the younger rocks. And he called that the principle of inclusions. In other words, you can take some of those old pieces, put them in the younger matrix, if you will, like if it's a conglomerate, right? You've got clasts that are relatively young, and then you could put that into the younger rocks that are relatively old. You could put those into the younger rocks above. It doesn't tell you that the old, it tells you that has to be, because it includes those inclusions, it has to be the younger bed that includes the inclusions from the bed below. I got a diagram. I'll explain that to you maybe a little bit better when I can get the words out right now. But in other words, especially when you look at breccias and conglomerates, you have to have that rock there first. You bust it up. You weather it a little bit. You may round it off in the case of conglomerates, right? So that's one of the key things we look for in conglomerates. So in that conglomerate, then, it had to be derived. Those clasts had to be derived from an older rock. And so that older rock has to be older than what's that conglomerate. So the conglomerate, in fact, has to be younger because of the class that includes them. So that is the idea of cross-cutting relationships and the idea of inclusions. And so Lyell came up with inclusions. Hutton came up with the idea of cross-cutting relationships. I just got to show you just an illustration here. Now, this is one of the famous national parks in the West. This is called Arches National Park, and most people take pictures of the arches, and I take pictures of the faults. So this is the Moab Fault right over here. That is right across the highway from the entrance to Arches National Park, and you can see the fault here cuts across these layers of red sandstone and red shale. And you can see how that fault keeps reappearing, and you can see how it's kind of sliced up. Well, I guess you could use the analogy of sliced bread, right? You have to have a loaf of bread first before you can cut it. And that's what it's illustrating here. Those rocks had to be there first, and then the fault began to cut it. And it cut it pretty complexly. It didn't use like a bread slicer to cut this thing up, in fact. So you have all these various layers that are cut into through those fault systems. And so this is called the Moab Fault right here. So the faults have to be younger than the rocks they cut, right? So one of the things we do in geology is we always solve puzzles. And the puzzle in this case is, the puzzle is pretty interesting. It's either the age or the origin of something. And so in this case, it's more the story that it tells about the tectonic events that have occurred. So in this case, you're looking at a diagram. It's called a block diagram. And you're looking at the history of a certain area. Now, as human beings, we walk across the surface of this, and we usually don't get to peek where it's been cut into, except in a few special cases. That's why quarries are so important to us. That's why drill core is so important to us. It's also why we love big outcrops, right? So like the Grand Canyon, you can walk up the Grand Canyon, you can see the layers there. Well, this one, it just takes that block, punches it out, and say, here, check this out. Can you figure out this puzzle? So the first thing that we look at this, and there's a big blob of B there, right? Oh, B is actually an intrusive of some sort, right? So if you have an intrusive, it must have intruded into something, right? What did it intrude into? Well, that would be A in this case. So you notice over here on the right-hand side, it shows a whole bunch of folded strata, and there's a very irregular contact around B. Well, B intruded into A. So the one that was there first, of course, had to be A. And so there's A that was there first, B intruded into it, and then if you look, there's a couple of faults. One of them does not cut into B, but one cuts through B. So which one's older? The one that doesn't cut into A. When B intruded into A, it also gobbled into that fault. You can see that over here on the right-hand side of that block diagram, just to the left of that dike, which is D, right? So that fault had to have occurred in A before B intruded into it. So if we're going to go through here, you'd have to say that A existed first, and at some point it got folded, right? And so it folded in a mountain building event of some sort. You're going to learn these. They're called orogenies. In that orogeny, it folded those rocks, and then it was faulted at some point. And that fault cut through A, and then B intruded into it eventually, and was placed then into that succession. And then at some point, there must have been uplift, because A is cut by an unconformity just below C. You see where C is there? C is actually referring to that surface. It's not referring to that rock body there. So the yellowish sort of like layered body that's above A there on the right-hand side and also on the left-hand side, there's an unconformity that cuts across there. That's that squiggly line. And so that squiggly line that cuts through there doesn't cut the dike. So the dike hasn't been in place yet when that unconformity came across, but it cut the top of A, it cut the top surface of that fault, and then it goes over, and then it's cut, the unconformity is cut by fault F. That's really important. It shows you that fault F is really, really young compared to C and to B and to A, right? And so A was first, it got folded, then it got faulted, then it got intruded into, then it got uplifted, then it got eroded by C. And then what happened? Well, it looks like F finally came along and cut those beds. Now you don't get E on the left-hand side of that fault. So E is also cut by that fault, however. So E must have been there at some point before it got cut by that fault, right? So it's just been removed by erosion at the top of that yellowish layered unit there, right? So E was one of the last things that happened here, but then F cuts it as a fault, and then an erosional surface develops at the top. So there's a mountain building event, faulting, intrusion. I forgot to tell you about D. D comes in. It doesn't get cut by the unconformity, but it's cut by an unconformity below the base of E, right? And so that D has to be younger than that fault. In fact, all of these are in order. And so that's what makes this a convenient sort of thing to show you. So A is the oldest here. B is younger than that, but remember that fault is even younger than B. And then C, that unconformity cuts across there. Then you get deposition across that. And then that dike comes through. And then there's another unconformity. And then E is deposited. And then F is the fault that cuts at the very end. It's all written down here too. Okay, there's a lot of thinking that has to go in. It looks like a simple diagram, but you have to interpret it. So it really, I love solving problems anyway, puzzles and things like this. I do the jumbles all the time in the newspaper, and then I also do Sudokus and things like that, right? So they're a lot of fun. It keeps your mind active. It's like, and we use it all the time in geology, as it turns out. It's like I still, 40 years into this career, and I'm still using the same principles that I learned in my my principles of geology class. We solve problems. We solve puzzles like this. How did this happen? And so what is the timing of it's the other thing that we have. So processes and timing are really important in geology. And that's kind of neat. And so that takes us through most of this presentation. I have one last slide to show you here. And that's the difference in cross-cutting relationships where you have inclusions. So you can see the inclusions on the left-hand side. You can see, okay, that's the symbol we use for igneous rock down here at the bottom. In this case, it happens to be a granite. A little I essentially stands for igneous. And so it's in a random pattern. And so that's a granite at the very bottom down here. This is actually based on the idea of the Grand Canyon, right? So in the Grand Canyon, you get a granite that's called the, let's say you get the Vishnu schist, and then you get the Zoroaster Granite. So that's the Zoroaster Granite here. Now, because the Zoroaster Granite was eroded, or weathered first, and then eroded, and then redeposited in that sandstone, so that's going to be the Tapete sandstone above it there. In that case, you can actually see this is the Grand Canyon succession on the left-hand side, because those granite clasts tell us that that sandstone is younger than the granite because some of the granite clasts are included in it. If you look on the right-hand side, this is a little slightly different story. This is not the Grand Canyon. I don't know if I could put a place on it actually. Maybe in the house range. I don't know. But here you can see the granite has a very irregular contour. What they don't show you there is when you have an intrusion, pieces of that country rock will fall in to, well, the country rock is what we call it, right? You have to intrude into something, and that's called the country rock. And so when things fall off and fall into that, they call them xenoliths. And so a xenolith is a foreign rock, essentially. And so these pieces fall in. And stope blocks is another term that people use for them as well. And so they fall into that granite when that granite has intruded in, but the granite stopped at some point, cooled, and then it left these sandstone inclusions in there. That tells you that the sandstone had to be older than the granite on the right-hand side. So they tell you the ages here. So the granite on the left-hand side is older than the sandstone. The granite on the right-hand side has to be younger than the sandstone because of the inclusions in it. So that is how we look at cross-cutting relationships. That's how we look at inclusions as well. So for now, that's the end of the key geologic principles. The next place we're going in this is we're going to talk about absolute age dates and how they compare to relative age dates. So, well, anyway, I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks a lot. Yep. Bye now.